When I was younger, I believed the loudest person in the room was the smartest. The one who talked first, the one who always had an opinion. Life corrected me because years later I noticed something uncomfortable. The people who talked less were ahead, calmer, more respected, more powerful, not because they were quiet but because they were intentional. Silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, it is strategy. Let me show you why people who talk less always win in the long run. The first key point is that talking gives relief, but silence gives control. Think about the last time you blurted something out in the heat of a moment, something you later wished you could take back. Maybe it was in a meeting, or with a friend, or even with a family member. The words spilled from you like water from a cracked cup, urgent and unrestrained, and for a moment you felt lighter. That relief is real. There's a fleeting sense of freedom when we share our thoughts or frustrations, but it is temporary. The moment passes, and often so does your power. What you said might linger in someone else's mind, twisting in ways you never intended. Silence, on the other hand, is a reservoir. It doesn't just keep you safe from regret, it allows you to measure, to decide, to direct the flow of your energy in a way that talking rarely can. When you learn to speak less, you start to notice patterns that were invisible before. I remember watching a colleague who rarely spoke during team discussions. At first, everyone assumed he was shy or disengaged. He would nod, listen, maybe offer a single observation. But over months, I realized he knew the undercurrents of every project better than anyone else. He saw who was exaggerating, who was overconfident, who was unsure. By staying quiet, he gave himself the time to observe, to digest, to plan. And when he finally spoke, his words weren't just heard, they landed. Silence created a space around him that made every sentence matter. You begin to understand that every word you hold back is not repression. It is a careful investment of your influence. There's also a profound clarity that comes from silence. When you are not constantly talking, your mind has room to breathe. I once met a woman who kept journals filled with notes she never shared aloud. Each day, she wrote observations about her coworkers, about herself, about small injustices she noticed. She said she rarely spoke these thoughts because speaking too soon would dilute their power. Over time, the insights she captured guided her choices, shaped her strategy, and eventually led to promotions she never expected. She had been silent, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that words without context can mislead both others and ourselves. Silence allows thought to deepen, to mature, to become actionable. It is easy to mistake silence for passivity, but it is anything but that. I knew a young man who never volunteered opinions in meetings. People often dismissed him as unambitious, yet he spent evenings analyzing the company's strategies, studying patterns in client behavior, and quietly learning skills that no one else valued at the time. 2 years later, when a critical project came up, he executed it flawlessly. Everyone was amazed, not just by the results, but by the precision of his thinking. His quietude had not been weakness, it had been preparation. There is an unspoken power in restraint. To remain silent while others rush to be heard is to give yourself a hidden advantage that is almost impossible to detect, but impossible to ignore once it reveals itself. Another dimension of talking less is emotional preservation. Every time we speak in frustration, anger, or fear, we hand pieces of ourselves to the world. I once met a man who had a habit of arguing with colleagues whenever he felt wronged. He would leave the office drained, carrying the weight of every word exchanged, replaying conversations in his head for days. Later, he learned to pause, to breathe, to speak only when he had clarity. He noticed that most conflicts dissolved naturally when he remained silent, while his energy stayed intact. Silence doesn't mean ignoring problems, It means choosing which battles are worth the toll on your mind and which are better observed, understood, and waited out. Control is not about manipulation, it is about direction. Speaking less lets you decide the flow of your influence rather than being swept along by it. I knew a teacher who rarely interrupted her students. Some thought she was indifferent. Yet in her quietness, she watched gestures, listened to tone, noticed unspoken struggles. When she finally addressed a student or gave feedback, it struck precisely the right chord, creating understanding and respect far beyond what constant commentary could achieve. Silence gives you the ability to choose your moment, to align your words with your intentions, and to maximize their impact. Every spoken word carries energy, but every held word carries the potential to shape outcomes far beyond the immediate moment. Finally, silence teaches patience, which is a form of power we often underestimate. I met a young entrepreneur who would listen for hours in meetings without saying a word. People grew impatient with him, expecting constant input. But he waited, carefully noting opportunities and gaps in reasoning. Later, when he acted, his decisions were precise and effective. His competitors, who had spoken constantly, often stumbled in haste. Speaking less does not slow progress, it sharpens it. Silence gives your actions the clarity, timing, and precision that words alone can never achieve. It is not empty. It is preparation, observation, and strategy wrapped into one. And it is in that calm, deliberate space that true mastery begins. The second key point is that silence makes people underestimate you. And that can become your greatest advantage. I remember a team I once observed filled with people eager to prove themselves. Everyone spoke quickly, often over one another, their voices loud, their gestures animated. And then there was one colleague who barely spoke. People assumed he was inexperienced, that he lacked ideas, that he would be easy to outmaneuver. They relaxed around him. They revealed more than they realized. They spoke freely, sometimes too freely, confident that he wasn't paying attention. What they didn't know was that in his quiet, he was absorbing everything. The patterns of thought, the tendencies of his co-workers, the gaps in their logic. By letting them underestimate him, he created a space to learn, to position himself, to prepare. When you talk less, people naturally fill the silence with their own assumptions, often to their own disadvantage. I met a woman once who managed a small group at a non-profit. She rarely interjected in discussions, preferring to nod or ask subtle questions. At first, her team thought she was disengaged. They didn't anticipate that every observation she made, every note she took, was quietly shaping the direction of the entire project. By the time her guidance came, it was almost invisible but utterly decisive. People who underestimate her had no idea how carefully she had tracked every word, every hesitation, every unspoken doubt. That's the quiet advantage of being underestimated. It allows others to expose their intentions without knowing they are doing so. There's an almost strategic beauty in being underestimated. It reminds me of a chess game I once witnessed between two grandmasters. One played aggressively, moving pieces and announcing threats, drawing attention and energy. The other moved slowly, quietly, often leaving pawns and minor pieces seemingly unguarded. The first player laughed at the apparent weakness, then, move by move, the quiet player revealed a plan that was invisible until it was complete. The loud, obvious strategies had blinded the opponent to the subtle, deliberate path unfolding in silence. People who talk less create that same effect in life. They are underestimated because they are invisible, until their actions reveal a depth that surprises everyone. Being underestimated is not about deception or manipulation, it is about observation and patience. I once knew a man in a family business who never raised his voice in arguments. When others debated who would take on responsibilities, he sat quietly. His relatives thought he was uninterested, that he lacked ambition. Meanwhile, he carefully noted the weaknesses in operations, the gaps in attention, and the unspoken agreements between family members. Years later, when it came time for leadership transition, he stepped forward fully prepared, while those who had shouted and argued for years had exhausted themselves with no clear direction. Silence allowed him to understand, to wait, and to act with unmatched precision. The underestimated person has the gift of clarity that those who overtalk rarely achieve. I recall a friend who worked in corporate law, constantly surrounded by colleagues eager to display knowledge, fill silence, and be heard. She would rarely speak in meetings, simply asking one or two sharp, thoughtful questions at the right moment. Her peers often overlooked her presence. Yet, those questions were carefully crafted, informed by a deep understanding of the discussion, and they often revealed flaws that others had missed. By being underestimated, she could observe the full landscape, see the corners others ignored, and intervene at exactly the right moment. The power of silence lies in this ability to witness without interruption, to understand without revealing too soon. There is also a psychological edge in being underestimated. People instinctively lower their guard around those who speak less. I watched a young entrepreneur who rarely shared his vision publicly. Investors and competitors alike assumed he was inexperienced or slow to act. But behind the scenes, he was learning, experimenting, and building quietly. When he launched, his results were shocking. Not because he had outworked others alone, but because no one expected the depth, the strategy, or the foresight he had cultivated in silence. Underestimation gives you time to grow, to prepare, and to act in ways that surprise everyone, including yourself. Finally, being underestimated teaches restraint, which is a form of mastery few ever experience. There was a mentor I knew who spent years listening more than speaking, letting colleagues and clients talk themselves into revealing intentions, limitations, and desires. At first, people laughed at his quiet nature, assumed he had little to offer. Over time, those same people realized that he always knew more, anticipated problems better, and executed solutions with a precision that seemed almost effortless. Silence allowed him to observe and understand the full picture before taking action, turning underestimation into a quiet, almost invisible force that could change outcomes long before anyone realized it. It is in that calm, underestimated state that true power quietly gathers momentum. The third key point is that words lose value when used too often, and the moment you realize this, you start to see the world differently. I once knew a man who was endlessly talkative, always explaining, justifying, or sharing advice even when no one asked. At first, people admired his energy, his willingness to contribute, but over time, the more he spoke, the less anyone listened. His words became background noise, like a clock ticking in a quiet room, familiar and unremarkable. The lesson he didn't see at first was that value is not in volume, it is in rarity. Every word you save, every sentence you weigh before letting it go, carries a weight that cannot exist in constant chatter. Speaking less sharpens your impact in ways that are subtle but undeniable. I remember a teacher who rarely raised her voice, but when she did, the room fell completely silent. She didn't lecture, she spoke with intention, using just enough words to open minds and hearts. Students remembered her lessons not because she talked more than anyone else, but because her words were carefully measured, rare, and precise. In life, this is the same principle. The more you overspeak, the more diluted your presence becomes. When you choose your words wisely, every time you open your mouth, people lean in. Your silence creates an invisible gravity that makes what you say matter far beyond the moment it is spoken. There is a quiet art in holding back. I once observed a group of colleagues debating a project in a conference room. One man, quiet throughout the conversation, waited until the discussion was almost over. Then, in a single, calm sentence, he offered a perspective so clear and insightful that it reframed the entire project. No one remembered the hours of talking that preceded his comment. All that lingered was the power of that one thought. Speaking less does not mean being passive, it means being strategic, allowing your words to arrive like a well-timed arrow rather than a spray of bullets. When your speech is sparse but precise, it is impossible to ignore. Words that are overused lose their meaning, and this extends beyond professional spaces into relationships and personal life. I knew a couple who constantly told each other "I love you," but rarely paused to truly act on it or reflect on it. The phrases became routine, almost invisible. One day, one of them stopped saying it for weeks, focusing instead on gestures, attention, and presence. When the words finally returned, they carried more weight than ever. Human connection works the same way. If you speak constantly, your meaning fades. But if you hold your words for moments that matter, they resonate, linger, and leave a mark that time cannot erase. When you talk less, you also create space for observation and insight. I once met a young entrepreneur who kept quiet during negotiations, letting others dominate the conversation. At first, he seemed inexperienced, but while everyone else was busy filling the air with words, he was listening, noting every hesitation, every assumption, every subtle shift in tone. His rare contributions later in the negotiation carried immense influence precisely because he had spent so long understanding the environment rather than trying to control it with constant speech. Silence becomes a canvas on which every spoken word stands out vividly, painting a picture others cannot ignore. There is a psychological effect too. In speaking less, scarcity creates attention. People instinctively notice what they rarely encounter. I remember a musician who only performed a few times each year, yet each performance felt electric, unforgettable. His silence in the months between created anticipation, a hunger for his artistry. Life works the same way. When you speak less, you create attention and expectancy. People listen more closely. They remember what you say. Your words do not float by unnoticed, they anchor themselves in memory. Silence, in this sense, is the amplifier of influence. Invisible but profoundly effective. Finally, speaking less teaches you the discipline to align words with truth. I once worked with a writer who spent weeks choosing a single sentence, editing and refining it, until it expressed exactly what he wanted. He understood that too many words can obscure meaning, but the right words can cut through confusion and hesitation. In life, the same principle applies. When your words are scarce, they are naturally filtered through reflection, intention, and integrity. You speak when it matters, not when it is convenient. Every sentence becomes a reflection of thought, presence, and purpose, giving you a subtle power that loud voices, no matter how persistent, can never achieve. The fourth key point is that silence protects you from unnecessary damage in ways most people never notice until it's too late. I once knew a man who had a habit of speaking first and reacting immediately to every slight, every critique, every misstep he perceived in others. At first, people admired his quick wit, his courage to voice opinions without hesitation. But over the years, he began to realize that many of the wounds he carried, resentments, regrets, fractured relationships, came directly from the words he had let slip in moments of haste. Every sharp retort, every defensive explanation had cost him energy, peace, and trust that no apology could fully restore. Silence, he eventually discovered, was a shield, a way to move through the world without leaving behind fragments of himself that others might misuse. When you pause before speaking, you gain the ability to measure the consequences of your words. I remember a woman in a corporate setting who had a fiery temper. She used to respond immediately to emails that upset her, typing sentences full of frustration. Once sent, there was no taking them back, and the ripple effect lasted far longer than she expected. She realized that by waiting, Even for just a few hours, she could see the situation more clearly. Many conflicts resolved themselves before she needed to intervene. Silence became her tool not for avoidance, but for discernment, allowing her to choose whether words would heal, escalate, or simply be unnecessary. There is a hidden power in observing before reacting. I once knew a young teacher who was constantly surrounded by students pushing boundaries. Her colleagues rushed to discipline, to explain, to justify their actions. She, however, often said nothing immediately, instead, watching and listening. She noticed patterns, what motivated each student, when tempers would flare, how peer dynamics influence behavior. Weeks later, when she acted, her interventions were precise, subtle, and lasting. No drama, no shouting, no regrets. Silence had protected her from unnecessary mistakes and allowed her actions to carry far greater influence than words ever could. Not all words require a response, and the damage that comes from responding too quickly is often invisible at first. I remember a man who constantly tried to correct misunderstandings in his friend circle. Every misheard remark or unintended insult prompted a long explanation from him, and over time, he noticed the strain it placed on relationships. People began to avoid him, not because he was wrong, but because his insistence on immediate clarification created tension. When he started speaking less, letting some things go without comment, he noticed that most misunderstandings resolved naturally, and his connections grew stronger. Silence had protected him from the invisible friction that comes from over-engagement. There is also an emotional preservation in silence. I knew a colleague who had a habit of sharing every frustration, every disappointment, immediately with anyone willing to listen. She felt relieved in the moment, but found herself replaying conversations for weeks, carrying the emotional weight of every word she had spoken. When she learned to pause, to keep some thoughts private, she discovered that her energy remained intact, her mind clearer, her focus sharper. Silence does not mean suppressing yourself. It means choosing which battles deserve your voice and which can pass without a trace, protecting your emotional health while the world continues in its own noise. Silence also prevents unintended consequences. I recall a young lawyer who often spoke to demonstrate knowledge, correcting clients and colleagues at every opportunity. His intentions were pure, but his words sometimes alienated those he wished to guide. One day, a mentor told him that speaking less would give him more influence because people would listen when he did choose to speak. He tried it and gradually discovered that his silence allowed him to observe more, choose interventions more wisely, and build trust more effectively. Every word he spoke after practicing restraint carried far more impact precisely because it had survived the filter of deliberate thought. Finally, learning the protective power of silence is a process of patience, self-mastery. I met a young entrepreneur who constantly felt compelled to justify every decision he made, especially under scrutiny. He realized that rushing to explain, defending choices at every question, often invited more criticism than understanding. Over time, he began to step back, to respond only when necessary, to let his actions demonstrate his reasoning instead of words. The unnecessary damage, friction, stress, misunderstandings diminished. Silence had become more than a habit. It had become a form of armor, a quiet strategy that preserved his energy, his focus, and ultimately, his ability to act with clarity when it mattered most. The fifth key point is that quiet people think longer and act better, because silence creates the space where clarity grows. I once knew a young engineer who never spoke much in team meetings. At first, his colleagues thought he was disengaged or lacking ideas. But while they filled the room with constant chatter, he was quietly connecting dots, tracing patterns in problems that no one else had noticed. Weeks later, when he presented a solution, it wasn't just a fix, It was a strategy that transformed the entire workflow. His silence hadn't been emptiness, it had been preparation. Thinking in the quiet moments gives your mind room to weigh possibilities, see consequences, and shape actions with precision. When you stop rushing to respond, you begin to notice the subtleties others miss. I remember a doctor I worked with who was always observing before speaking. He didn't interrupt patients, didn't immediately offer diagnoses. He listened, studied symptoms, and watched expressions. Many of his colleagues would jump to conclusions, eager to assert authority. But in those quiet moments, he often discovered the details that changed the course of treatment entirely. Thinking longer before acting allows you to gather not only information, but perspective. You begin to understand the invisible forces at play, the motivations beneath words, the patterns beneath chaos. Silence also gives you the chance to separate emotion from decision. I knew a young manager who used to react impulsively to criticism. Each raised voice or challenging comment would trigger a response, sometimes heated, often regrettable. Eventually, he tried a different approach. He began to observe, to pause, to let the initial emotion settle before speaking. Over time, he noticed that decisions made from the calm, reflective state were far more effective than those made in haste. Quiet thinking allows you to process not just the facts, but the emotional currents, so that your actions are grounded in wisdom rather than reaction. Reflection in silence is also a form of strategy. I once watched a chess tournament where one of the players moved slowly, almost meditatively, while the rest of the room buzzed with excitement and chatter. Opponents would rush, trying to assert dominance, and often fell into traps they hadn't seen. The quiet player waited, considered, calculated, and when he acted, it was decisive. Life often mirrors this same principle. When you pause and think deeply, you anticipate moves before others do. You see possibilities that remain invisible to those who are constantly speaking or reacting, and your choices carry a precision that others cannot match. There is an energy that grows from quiet thinking, a sense of internal alignment that comes from moving deliberately. I once knew a writer who spent months observing the world in silence before starting a novel. She took notes, recorded conversations, and reflected on small gestures and patterns. By the time she began to write, every sentence carried depth and intention. The power of thinking longer is that it builds not only clarity but confidence. When action finally emerges, it is rooted in understanding, not impulse. The person who thinks in silence moves with purpose that is unmistakable. Quiet reflection also allows you to see beyond immediate problems to long-term consequences. I remember an entrepreneur who often faced urgent challenges from competitors, investors, and shifting markets. While others reacted quickly, scrambling to show effort, he would step back, analyze trends, and model outcomes in his mind. Many thought he was slow or indecisive. In reality, his silence gave him foresight. By thinking longer, he was able to act at the right moment, turning challenges into opportunities that everyone else had missed. Thinking before acting transforms obstacles into stepping stones. Finally, the habit of thinking longer cultivates patience, which is itself a hidden superpower. I once met a young athlete who refused to rush decisions on the field, even under pressure. While teammates shouted, gestured, and tried to force plays, he scanned the entire game, observing patterns in both opponents and allies. His eventual moves were not just effective, they were game-changing. Life rewards those who pause, observe, and allow thought to mature. Silence is the soil where patience grows, and patience allows your actions to carry weight far beyond the immediacy of the moment, shaping outcomes in ways impulsive speech or hurried decisions never could. The sixth key point is that silence builds inner strength in ways that talking never can. I once met a man who felt the constant need to explain himself to everyone around him. Every opinion he had, every decision he made seemed to require validation from others. He was exhausted, constantly chasing approval, and yet he felt misunderstood no matter how hard he tried. One day, someone quietly observed him and said, "What if you stopped explaining? What if your actions spoke louder than your words?" At first, he resisted the idea. But over time, as he practiced restraint, he realized that the fewer words he spoke to justify himself, the lighter he felt inside. Silence had begun to strengthen him from within, giving him a confidence that could not be shaken by external judgment. When you stop explaining yourself, you discover a freedom that many never experience. I remember a young woman who always felt compelled to clarify her choices at work, at home, even in casual conversations with friends. She thought if she didn't, people would think less of her. Slowly, she began to hold back, to speak only when necessary, to let her actions tell the story instead. The first few weeks were uncomfortable, the quiet felt like an empty space. But soon she noticed a subtle shift. She no longer relied on constant validation, and the approval she did receive felt more genuine because it came from people who had observed her actions rather than being told what to think. Inner strength grows in those empty spaces we create through silence. Silence teaches resilience in a way that words cannot. I once worked with a mentor who rarely raised his voice or explained his perspective to others. Many people mistook his quiet for passivity, but beneath that calm exterior, he had cultivated a steel-like resilience. He faced challenges, criticism, and misunderstandings without being shaken because he no longer tied his self-worth to the opinions of others. Every moment of restraint reinforced his belief in himself. Inner strength is like a muscle. It grows with use, and practicing silence is a powerful way to exercise it, to condition your mind to stand steady when storms arise. There is also key clarity that comes from being alone with your thoughts. I met an artist who spent months in solitude before sharing any of her work publicly. During that time, she stopped justifying her style, stopped asking for feedback at every step, and instead focused on understanding her own vision. By the time her first exhibition opened, her work resonated deeply because it carried the weight of personal truth rather than external expectation. Silence allows you to reflect without distraction, to listen to your own instincts and to strengthen the voice inside that does not rely on applause or approval. That inner voice becomes a compass that guides every decision you make. Holding back words also creates a quiet confidence that others instinctively notice. I remember a young lawyer who spoke only when he had considered the full impact of his argument. In courtrooms filled with noise, competing opinions, and heated debate, his calm, measured statements carried enormous weight. Colleagues and clients alike learned to respect his presence because he no longer felt the need to fill every silence. People are drawn to strength that does not announce itself, and silence nurtures that strength quietly, steadily, in ways that words alone cannot convey. Inner strength is also about control over your emotions and reactions. I once knew a businessman who had a habit of over-explaining every mistake, every minor error in judgment. When he began to practice restraint, he noticed that his stress diminished. He no longer reacted to every comment or critique with defensiveness. He started observing, learning, and choosing when to respond and when to let situations unfold naturally. The more he embraced silence, the more capable he felt of handling challenges without being consumed by them. Strength in this sense is not aggression or loudness, it is the calm mastery of your own energy. Finally, silence allows you to discover your true self without the distortion of constant feedback. I met a young student who spent years trying to meet everyone else's expectations, explaining herself at every step, adjusting her opinions to fit others' approval. When she stopped over-explaining and began spending time in quiet reflection, she felt a profound sense of alignment. She started making decisions rooted in her values, not in the desire to be understood or liked. Inner strength emerges from these moments, from the quiet realization that you do not need constant affirmation. It is in silence that we learn to stand alone, to trust ourselves, and to move through the world with a quiet, unshakable power. The seventh key point is that in the long run, results speak louder than words. And this is a truth most people fail to grasp until they've spent years exhausting themselves in noise. I once knew a man who was always talking about his plans, his projects, his strategies, his ideas. He would announce every intention to anyone who would listen, convinced that sharing made him accountable, that people would admire his ambition. But over time, I noticed that those who spoke less, who kept their efforts private, were quietly building something that no amount of talking could replicate. Their work accumulated layer by layer, while the loudest voices often ended up with a trail of unfinished promises. Actions, not words, create weight in the world. There's a subtle difference between effort that is broadcast and effort that is lived. I remember a young entrepreneur who rarely discussed his plans. While others spent energy explaining their goals, he spent hours observing markets, refining products, and testing ideas in silence. A year later, when his launch finally happened, it felt inevitable, almost as if success had quietly built itself around him. The people who had spent so much time talking about their intentions were stunned, scrambling to catch up, still trying to explain why they hadn't acted sooner. Results, born from quiet dedication, do not announce themselves. They simply appear, undeniable and permanent. The power of results over words is also deeply psychological. I once worked with a teacher who spoke sparingly in faculty meetings. At first, her colleagues underestimated her, assuming she had little to contribute. But her classroom results were exceptional. Students excelled, projects thrived, and initiatives she quietly influenced succeeded beyond expectation. By the time others recognized her impact, it was impossible to deny. Words may persuade temporarily, but results demand attention, respect, and even admiration, without a single claim needing to be made. Those who rely solely on speech often find their voices fade, while those who focus on outcomes create an unshakable presence. There is a patience that comes with prioritizing results over words. I once met a young athlete who never boasted about his training, never posted progress, never sought recognition in the gym. His peers were loud, competitive, and constantly talking about their routines. Yet over the seasons, he quietly outperformed them all. He didn't need to announce improvement because the scoreboard told the story. Results are the ultimate language, and silence often cultivates the patience required to see them fully manifest. When you act first and speak later, or not at all, your work carries a weight that conversation alone can never achieve. Results also strip away superficial judgments. I remember a woman in the corporate world who stopped explaining every step of her decisions. She stopped defending her strategies to colleagues and supervisors alike. While others were caught in endless discussions, she focused on execution. Her projects succeeded, clients were impressed, and her reputation grew. By the time recognition came, it was undeniable, beyond argument. Actions, not words, cut through opinion, doubt, and criticism. People may ignore your explanations, but they cannot ignore tangible results. It is in these moments that quiet effort becomes a force stronger than any rhetoric. Relying on results rather than words teaches humility as well as authority. I knew a young musician who practiced for years without performing, without posting online, without seeking validation. Meanwhile, peers were constantly promoting themselves, seeking applause for every minor achievement. When the musician finally debuted, the depth, precision, and authenticity of his performance left audiences in awe. Silence had allowed skill to mature, patience to develop, and confidence to build without the distortion of external judgment. True authority comes from what you have built, not from what you claim to have built. Finally, the cumulative effect of quiet, results focused effort is profound. I once watched a small team working under a leader who rarely spoke in meetings. He set expectations, observed, and guided only when necessary. Over time, the team became exceptional, producing outcomes that others could only envy. No one remembered the words he had spoken, but everyone remembered the impact he had made. In the long run, the world responds not to promises, not to speeches, not to loud claims of capability. It responds to consistent, meaningful results. Those who talk less but act more do not just succeed, they leave a legacy that speaks long after words have faded. And so, when you step back and look at the path of those who speak less, you begin to see the quiet thread that runs through their lives. Not the noise of explanation, not the urge to be heard, but the steady rhythm of thought, observation, and action. Each choice measured, each word considered, each moment of silence a small act of mastery. The world may rush, demanding that you prove yourself at every turn, but strength grows in the spaces between words. Patience, clarity, and quiet perseverance are not passive. They are the foundations on which lasting impact is built. You may have doubts. You may wonder if remaining silent will leave you unseen or unheard. But over time, the truth reveals itself. The person who thinks before speaking, who acts with intention, who measures the weight of their words, moves through life with a presence that cannot be ignored. Respect is not demanded through sound. It is earned through depth, through consistency, through the subtle power of restraint. In silence, you discover yourself, the part of you that does not need applause, that does not rely on validation, that carries your purpose with quiet confidence. There is a rare rhythm to living this way, a balance between listening and acting, between observing and deciding. Each pause, each withheld word is not emptiness, it is preparation. It is space for reflection, space to understand what truly matters, space to shape outcomes that endure beyond fleeting attention. You begin to notice patterns, see possibilities, and respond with precision rather than haste. In this quiet, your presence grows heavier, your influence deeper, and your inner life stronger than ever before. And perhaps the most profound lesson is that the world will not always recognize your patience or your restraint. It does not matter. The reward is in the transformation that happens within you, in the way you learn to trust yourself, to act from clarity rather than impulse, to move through challenges without being carried away by every distraction or noise. When you speak, your words carry meaning. When you act, your results carry weight. Your life itself becomes a measure of thoughtfulness, integrity, and quiet power. Step forward into this life with a sense of calm certainty. Know that the moments you spend listening, reflecting, and holding back are not wasted. They are investments in the life you are quietly building. Over time, the accumulation of these moments creates strength, resilience, and a clarity that no hurried words can provide. The world may reward noise, but it cannot ignore depth. You are capable of carrying your intentions with subtlety and precision. You are capable of moving deliberately, letting your actions speak in ways that words cannot. And in that stillness, you find a strength that is unshakable, not imposed, not performed, but real, rooted in your choices and your presence. Carry this understanding with you as you return to your life. Let the quiet guide you, let observation shape you, and let your actions define you. Over time, you will notice something remarkable. The world begins to respond, not because you have shouted the loudest, but because you have moved with thought, acted with purpose, and held a presence that is steady, undeniable, and profoundly lasting.